And hello, we're live. So today we are talking about chapter 13 in the Statistical Rethinking book version 2, which calls itself Monsters and Niches. And this was the chapter, I think, where so far I have gotten the most, I want to say annoyed, but it's a very harsh word. But for now, let's just run with it. Annoyed with the naming scheme that McElraith has adopted, because these prosaic titles really will make it rather difficult to flip back to chapters which are of relevance to me later on. So for the sake of our meeting today, I have redubbed this hybrid and ordered models, because I think that is what this is after. And if you've got another interpretation, feel free to throw it at me and we can change this title. But for now, let's just get straight into it and talk about the first of these hybrid or ordered models, which is an over-dispersed model. Now, over-dispersed models simply just come about when there is more variation in count generating processes than we would expect. And that could either be through binomial processes or through Poisson processes, but we need to account for this added heterogeneity of the rates or of the probabilities of success across different study setups with some extra models. These are also called continuous mixture models. Now, if we're concerned with a binomial setup, then we would like to employ a beta binomial mixture model. With this one, each binomial count observation has its own probability of success. So for each individual setup for which we obtain a certain number of trials and a certain number of successes from a coin toss, for example, we would estimate the individual probability of success, so that by the end, our model estimates distribution of probability of success across all of our different study cases. This distribution is altered in its shape by the predictors that our model takes. And so the outcome distribution that we're after is based on the beta distribution, which is identified by P and I think this is theta. I always get my Greek letters mixed up. So if this isn't theta, please let me know. So P is the average probability in a beta distribution, and theta just gives us the shape of the distribution, where a theta value of smaller than 2 identifies the case where extreme probabilities are likely. So either stuff always happens or stuff never happens. Whereas a theta value of greater than 2 and increasingly so enforces centrality of the probabilities towards that average probability of P. The beta binomial outcome distribution, which we want to use for our beta binomial model to account for over-dispersion in binomial setups, a very long run-on sentence, sorry about that, just adds the number n, which is the number of cases or observations for each of which we want to allow individually identified probabilities of success. Now, all of this is pretty complex, and the next model, the negative binomial and gamma Poisson, doesn't get...
Wait. Does that mean that if you have theta less than 2, you expect an under-dispersed distribution?
No. The theta just tells us where our model expects most of the probability mass to lie in that distribution of probabilities. So what we get from our beta binomial or the beta distribution is a probability distribution of probabilities. And theta just tells us where to put the weight. Is it in the tails or is it in the center? So just to clarify on this, you might, for example, have over-dispersion if you do coin flips, and in some of the cases you have weighted coins which predominantly come up heads and other coins which predominantly come up tails. And for those, you would like to have this theta shape or the beta shape with most of the mass and the tails. So a theta smaller than 2, because either you always land on tails or you never land on tails. And not accounting for this particular shape, you would just land on the average in the middle and then have an over-dispersion, because your model fails to see the heterogeneity. I think this was, by the way, the first question of yours that I could sufficiently answer with us going back and forth. I am proud of myself, to say the least.
That was really helpful as well. Thanks for asking that question, because that's something that it went over my head.
I know. I saw you smiling and shaking your head when I said probability of a probability distribution of probabilities. It's just getting weirder and weirder at this point. So
there's
moving
like
on.
a quick philosophical thing. There's also like two ways of thinking about these mixes, right? Either you do as we did when we had these lectures, where he basically thought of it as like a hierarchical model, where he like with the lizard thingy of like cover or whatever it was, he added like a normal distribution like one level up to get like over dispersion. So you can think of it as like a hierarchical model, which is apparently like how cool kids think about it. The way I think about it is basically you hack your likelihood function, right? So I don't think about it as adding an extra hierarchy. I just think about like the thing that says that evaluates the likelihood of a simple data point. That one is just like a mixture or like a hacked function that has more stuff in it. So I see it as like the same hierarchy, because I see those two like as being like, that's just like the likelihood that is different.
And I think that is where the week after next week, because we're not having a meeting next week, will probably come in handy, because that one will probably, if I saw correctly, introduce hierarchies and models. So let's move on for now and talk about over-dispersed Poisson models. So if there's a big difference in rates which produce counts, we would like to model this with a negative binomial or gamma Poisson model, where each Poisson count has its own rate. So for each setup, for each study case, we now have varying rates instead of varying probabilities of success. So you can see this extension of binomial into Poisson still holds true for these models as well. So again, we just estimate a distribution of rates across our cases, which again is altered in its shape by the predictors. This is based on the gamma distribution, as gamma Poisson might suggest, which itself is informed by lambda and phi, where lambda is the rate, much like in basic Poisson, and phi is just the variance. So that is the variance of our rates, and lambda is just the central rate. The variance must be positive, and the larger this value, the closer the gamma distribution is to the base Poisson distribution. With that being said, what these models try to do is attempt to account for unobserved heterogeneity. And without going to go too much more into details on these, even though we will have some in the exercise material for today, the book also stated in very unambiguous terms that these are usually best addressed through multi-level models, or GLMMs, which will be the topic of our next in-person session. Let's talk about zero inflation. That's another one which prompts us to think about hybrid models or mixture models. Zero inflation is something that I am quite confident in saying all of us have encountered so far at some point. Maybe not Ollie, because he's very early on in his career, but you.
No, I've come across it.
What haven't you done at this point? So Ollie's seen it too. And zero inflation is literally just what the name suggests. We have an overly large abundance of zeros in our count data sets. This is the case in much of our observational data sets because observations of zero counts may arise through multiple processes. So this is along the philosophical line of absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. This is because hidden states determine system processes, and we need to account for these. So not seeing a certain animal on a walk of a transect might not necessarily tell us that the animal just isn't there. It might also just tell us that the conditions were so bad that we couldn't see it. And that would be a hidden state, which to us, as the person who just gets the data set in many cases, might be actually truthfully hidden, because we do not have access to that. So the book example, as well as the lecture example,
I think it's more parsimonious to say that absence of evidence is weak evidence of absence instead of strong.
Sorry, come again?
That absence of evidence is weak evidence of absence instead of strong evidence of absence. It's still like, if you have a zero, it's either because there's X in the zero, or it's because of this other process.
Yes. to put it in Bayesian terms, absence of evidence would definitely be an informative prior, which needs to be tested afterwards. So we can make, I see some thinking faces. So absence of evidence would give us a certain idea of the likelihood that we actually have evidence of absence has increased because we do have absence of evidence, but we're not 100% certain of it. So that is just taking what Jan just said and putting it into Bayesian terms. Fully agree with you on this, by the way, Jan.
Like in this example you have, like the zero inflated, right? It's like a third of the absence are actually because of some other process, but the other 2/3 of them are actually true zeros and therefore actually absence of evidence, right?
Yeah. I think this is about whether you make it a quantitative or a qualitative statement. And if you make it a qualitative one, then you can just say that one is not the other. But if you make it quantitative, which is where we're headed, then you can say weakly they are the same.
Agreed.
Cool, loving it. So back to the example, which looks at numbers of manuscripts produced each day in medieval monasteries by monks who have a habit of getting so wasted on certain days that they do not produce anything. And oh boy, does that make me feel like I'm a bachelor student again, because this was my life. So the way this is zero inflated is because what our initial models would look at is just the Poisson process, which tries to identify the rate at which monks generate manuscripts. However, this process necessarily assumes that this is the rate at which monks produce manuscripts while they are working. And when they're drunk, they're not working. So we need to identify how often they are drunk. And this is where the hidden state comes in. The hidden state here is, are they drunk or are they working? There are no other ways in life. Either you're drunk or you work. This, drawn up more DAG style, tells us that we start with a binomial process. The binomial process just tells us, do we drink, do we work? In this case, the success criterion is work. We can debate whether this is prudent, but for now, we will just say that working is more successful than drinking. Once we have, oh no, sorry, in this example, it's actually the other way around, which again, we could debate, because in this example, you can see the success probability P actually identifies that people are drunk and don't work. So we're going from the binomial process to the left with the probability of P, the probability of P standing for people get drunk and don't work. Now, anytime that our people actually work, we could still produce zero manuscripts. And that's just because that day no one finished one, because it takes multiple days to finish manuscripts. And so we could still observe zeros on days where all of our monks were working. However, we can also observe non-zeros, so a certain number of n manuscripts which have been produced on any given day when people are working. And this is just going with the hidden state of the binomial process in the first place, and then the Poisson likelihood of observing n following that people haven't gotten drunk. And to put all of that into a model, we use a zero inflated Poisson distribution, and this chapter introduced a number of new distributions, all of which I have tried to summarize to the best of my ability in the PDF transcript of the book chapter that's also available at our link. So if you feel yourself wanting to look at what the individual parameters mean in these distributions and want to have that for later, it's all up there. But for now, we want to run with the zero inflated Poisson. The zero inflated Poisson is informed by P, the probability of observing zero outright without any Poisson process, and then the rate lambda, which tells us on a day where people are working, how many manuscripts are actually produced. And this comes with two underlying links. You can see we're now combining a binomial with a Poisson model. So this is where the mixture comes in. And with this mixture, we also need to use the appropriate link functions for both of these underlying outcome distributions, where the appropriate link for a binomial is the logit, and the appropriate link for a Poisson is the log. You can see that here. These both are defined through linear models, which we can create ourselves, and then feed into our outcome distribution, which then determines the outcome of how many counts of manuscripts do we have each day. And what we get from the Bayesian model are the estimates of pi and lambda I, so just p and lambda, which then, if we back transform it through inverse logit for p and exponentiating for lambda, it's just taking the inverse of the link function to get to the outcome distribution or outcome space, we can then identify what the average probability of people just not working and the average rate of people producing manuscripts when they work is. And I think this is beautiful. And actually, now that I explain it, this makes so much sense to me, and I am loving it. So what you can see here is that there's a hierarchy of predictors slowly being introduced. More of this is to come next week, but you can see how if the binomial process has, sorry, the week after next week, you can see how if the binomial process has a certain outcome, the Poisson process may or may not come into effect at all. And I think this is just beautiful, because this is how I would think about this in a tallying up on paper kind of way. But now I've got a model that can do it. Sam, you've unmuted yourself.
I was just thinking. So that the Poisson process having an effect is dependent on whether the binomial process does what it does.
Yeah.
And allows that chain to do its thing, right?
Exactly. So if people get drunk and don't work,
yeah,
the Poisson process doesn't come into effect because it cannot. The process which would produce the counts, i.e. the manuscripts, doesn't even begin.
When I see things like this, I don't know about other people, but I get so nervous. Like, hierarchies really interest me in terms of the stats that we can do with them, and the DAGs I find super sexy. But with these sorts of things, I'm like, oh my goodness, I could really fuck this up if I tried to do this myself. Like, if I came from this position where it's not as obvious, like drunk work, like that dichotomy, and then building it that way, I can see how I could make a bunch of mistakes.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest fears with this so far is definitely just getting the hierarchy order wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that the next chapter may give us a bit more insight on that.
Yeah. But like, you can always just try to run, like, just generate fake data from your model and see if it looks like the real data.
True. You can always do posterior predictive checks. Which brings us back to the mantra at the beginning of when we started this. All of our models are mechanistically wrong, but they may be predictively accurate.
True. True. I wish I might go back and look at the posterior predictive, because I think that's coming out to be so necessary, especially when we start building more and more complex things.
We actually have quite a few of those during the exercise material today.
Perfect.
So you might be looking forward to that. I think it comes in the hard questions, but if we've got time and energy, we'll cover those too.
The problem with the posterior predictive check is that your model has to actually successfully run for you to make one. Right? So the step before that, if you're actually trying to make the model and you're not like really sure about your hierarchy, it's just to actually just step by step. If there's like 3 hierarchies, you just have like, you draw from the top level, then you draw from the middle level. You just do that mechanistically yourself, and you just make up parameters. Like, monks are drunk 20% of the time, and they make 3 manuscripts on average. You just make stuff like that, and then you see if you can reproduce your data. Like, whether you can reproduce your fake data is what matters, right?
Yeah.
This comes all back down to simulation.
Do you remember back in like elementary school where you first learn about algebra and that sort of thing, and then you like put in a number to try and make something work, and it just doesn't work, and then you like put in another number to see if it works? Like, they always call it, over in the States, they call it plug and chug. I don't know what they call it over Europe side of things,
Right.
but it feels like that.
just the trial and
like
error, the trial and error way of show that this equation does this.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'll move on and get to what was definitely the meatiest part of the chapter, as well as the video lecture material, which is also why I'm going to spend a bit more time on this one, which is ordered categories. I just call them OC here. The internet folk among us will recognize this as the abbreviation for original content, which my summary presentations certainly are not, because I cannibalize McElry's material to a T. So ordered categories are everything that is ordinal data. Ordinal data, and I know I'm explaining one thing with another thing that is basically the same. Ordinal data is basically just categorical data, which we can order in a meaningful way, but not do maths with. So this will lead us to run an ordered logistic model. Our outcomes, which we want to model here, those ordered categories, could be levels of agreement when you've taken a survey ranging from 1 to 5, I don't know, or sizes ranging from small to big. The importance here is that the distances between these might not be the same between each pair, but we are able to order them in a monotonous, so in one direction way. What I mean by this is we know that small is smaller than medium and medium is smaller than big, but maybe you have to double in size to go from average small to average medium, but you don't have to double in size to go from average medium to average big, but you have to quadruple in size instead. So you can see how the distances between these different bins that our data falls into may be very heterogeneous across the entire range. Otherwise, if the distances were exactly spaced evenly and we can order our stuff, then we may just want to run this as a numerical outcome. So on the right-hand side, you can see the example for this data set. Oh God, Anna has been in the waiting room and I think she's been there for a while. I am terribly sorry, Anna. Okay, continue on. On the upper right-hand side, you can see the example for this exercise. You can see how there's a bit of agreement responses to a certain survey. Hey, Anna, I'm sorry if you were in the waiting room for long. I did not see that message just until now. And you can see how we then identify the cumulative proportions and log cumulative odds of our different outcomes as they are reported in this histogram. This may come out of nowhere right now, and I will try to explain how this comes about. And we will start with talking about the ordered logistic model with the link function of the log cumulative odds. What does that mean? Or how does it end up looking like? What this ends up looking like is this over here on the left-hand side. The cumulative log odds are just defined as log, that's where the log part comes from, and then some odds, which are cumulative, which is how we get to that long name. Where we look at our response is just, in case of response 4, for example, our log cumulative odds is simply just the cumulative probability of 4 and everything below being answered divided by 1 minus this. So everything that's left over to the right-hand side. This may be unintuitive because what we want to have is, after all, just the proportion or probability of answering 4 and not the probability of answering 4 or less. And the way to get to this is visualized here on the right-hand side, where you can see what the step to go from the previous cumulative proportion to the next cumulative proportion is like. And this yellow band is that added proportion or probability. And that's what we want to identify for each of our categories. And to get to that, we simply just have to take the cumulative probability of the latter and subtract that by the cumulative probability of the former, and we just get that yellow bar left over. which is, after all, what we're after. With this right here being a logistic function, and the probability of discrete outcomes just being a subtraction of the adjacent values. And if this is the first time you are exposed to this, and you are confused by this right now, I highly suggest you go back to the lecture materials of the video, because I think McElrath does a really good job explaining it there at length. However, if you've got questions right now, please chug them out, because after all, that's what we're here for. And that does not seem to be the case. So I'm going to move on and talk about the model specification of ordered categories. So on the right-hand side, you can see how in R we have the d-ord logit function. By the way, in the aforementioned PDF summary of this chapter in the book, when I describe the different distributions that have been introduced with the different parameters that feed into them and what they're used for, I also include how you find them in R and what the function in R is for them. So right here, you can see our ulam specification, which just builds the stand code for us. We have our response. The response is driven through an ordered logistic function with some cut points. The cut points here are a vector of intercepts. So we want to have, so this model right here doesn't have any predictors, so we just want to look at intercepts, and we want to get the intercept for each of our responses being agreement with something being morally permissible in a trolley problem ranging from 1 to 7. With those cut points, we always have k minus 1, where k is the number of possible outcomes. So 1 to 7, we end up with 6 cut points. That is because for the highest ranking outcome, the cumulative odds are 1, because it always, for your answer always falls on the highest ranking or below. So we can just chug that out of the model. This is, we don't need to compute anything here. And this is expressed on logit scale. As I mentioned earlier, this right here is a logistic function. So we are talking about a logit scale here on those cut points. The linear model then influences every category. However, you do not see any linear model in here so far. When we run this, we get our cut points. You can see how we just get 1 to 6 cut points. So the 7th is omitted because that's literally just 1. And when we want to get to the actual probabilities of falling into any of these, so this is cumulative probabilities, that's very important here. We just have to do the inverse logit on these cut point estimates because we are on logit scale. So we back transform into probability space from logit scale by using inverse logit, and we then get our cumulative probabilities for each of our responses. These are the log cumulative probabilities. These are the cumulative proportions or probabilities. And this is our raw data plotted. So this is just what we saw before with the cumulative proportion. And if we were to look at the absolute values of our cut points on the right, and then our plotting on the left-hand side, these do match to a large extent, but not fully. Reason for this being that the posterior uncertainty allows for more informative identification of intercepts because they can give us the uncertainty. And due to this uncertainty, which you can see on this side over here, we may not have met the absolute mean from this histogram that we pulled straight from the data, but we have the added information of how certain we are of the values of our cumulative proportions for each of our cut points. And so,
question, Eric.
Yes,
so,
please.
The cut point, the amount of cut points is always the levels we have -1. So if we have like 51 different levels, then we have 50 cut points.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. This wasn't clear to me by reading the book. Nice.
Cool. And we're not throwing away one cut point to be cool. We're doing it because of the dummy variable trap. So just like when you have like males and females, if you do the indicator variable instead of the index variable, then one of them is going to be swallowed into the intercept. It's basically the same here. You have like have 6 deflections from the intercept.
Fantastic addition there. Just quickly tagging onto that, we do not do it to be cool, but we end up being quite cool. All right, I talked about a linear model earlier, and this is where we add variables. So the first thing to know about this is on the right-hand side. How are our intercepts influenced by other parameters to form our log cumulative proportions or our log cumulative odds? Interestingly enough, we have to put that subtraction in here. And yesterday I reached a point where this was clear to me. Today it eludes me a bit again, so I'm happy to discuss this. The important thing here being that positive parameter estimates indicate an increase in probability, and hence we want to have this link. So if our parameter beta, for example, is positive, we want that to identify an increase in probability of a certain outcome that we're looking at. What this comes down to, and this was the sentence yesterday that made it all clear for me, and today I'm struggling with it a tiny bit again, is that decreasing log cumulative odds for outcomes ordered below k, so that is these over here, shifts the probability mass towards k. So k being the outcome that we're currently interested in, let's say 4. Hence why we do the subtraction. And I can, there's a certain disconnect for me here, because I'm thinking we're looking at the log cumulative odds for it. All of this down here makes sense to me. If the log cumulative odds of everything below our current interest outcome is decreased, then of course there is more probability mass for us and also everything above us. So yes, that increases the likelihood of our current category being voted, for example. However, this specification over here looks at everything rated below what we're currently trying to identify the probability for and what we're trying to identify the probability for at the same time. And I think this is where my disconnect comes in right now. Do people follow, or have I just drawn red string on a pinboard?
I also forgot why you subtract this one. I just know it as something you do, so I'm also confused.
So I think for the interest of time, I suggest we just run with this for now. And then by the end of it, we'll do just like last time, where everyone who's interested just stays on and we talk about this more detail. Sound good? Cool. So to go back to our trolley example, what we're looking at here is trying to understand how permissible some people think it is to pull the lever in the very well-known trolley example, given some certain predictor variables. So whether you have to take action, do you have to pull the trolley to save more people than you would end up killing by pulling the lever? Does there have to be any contact? So do you have to push a person physically in front of the oncoming cart? And then a interaction effect back here, which gets estimated by itself through an intercept for that interaction, but then also the effect of action and contact separately from one another. We can put this into ULAM, in this case, just using our ordered logistic as we did before, but this time we have set phi to actually be estimated through a linear function instead of just being set to 0. And what we get is our linear model, then the linear model that specifies one of the interaction coefficients here, and our different priors and our cut points, just as we saw them previously, with this being our output. I won't go into these outputs for now, because the interpretation of these is all available in the book and the lecture. What I want to highlight more is how we can make sense of these, because all of these are on legit scale. We have to back transform them. And probably to understand what your model thinks about the world and the data is to look at a posterior prediction plot. In this case, the posterior prediction is a vector. This vector is a probability of observations belonging to each category. So this vector is as long as our cut points and just tells us about what's the probability of belonging to this cut point, this cut point, this cut point, this cut point. When we plot the posterior predictions, in this case, 4 different predictor values, so we are constructing counterfactual posterior prediction plots, as we encountered a few chapters back, where we fix some of our predictors to a certain variable. We fix predictors to a certain value, so we fix variables to values. And then we just toy around with one other of our predictor variables in its value range to see what the outcome is predicted to be. In this case, we predict, then we do so this is just prediction inverse logic to get to the actual probabilities. And what's interesting in these plots is not necessarily where the points fall individually, but much rather how big the gaps are between those points. Because these show us the difference or the certainty with, so the difference in or the certainty with which we assign the different ordered outcomes. So you can see in this example, when we have a no action, no contact scenario, intent doesn't really change much how likely we are to assign certain things. However, in a setting where we have action, no action, but contact with a person, and then go from no intent to intent in this trolley example, you can see how the moral permissibility really changes in certainty of assigning to a certain group or probability of assigning to a certain permissibility score from 1 to 7 really changes from no intent to intent, or we now get more clustered values. And so last but not least, we may also have ordered categorical predictors. Ordered categorical predictors are pretty much the same, at least data-wise, as our ordered categories as outcomes. So these assume potentially different sizes of predictor values, which influence our outcome, which follow the same direction, so monotonic, small, medium, big, but potentially different distances between the different effects. So each predictor value receives a unique parameter, and each parameter estimate then sums to a total maximum effect of this predictor. So if we take all of our different individual parameter estimates for ordered categorical predictors, we take the sum of them. This is the total maximum effect of this predictor. You can think of this as education levels, for example, where we go from elementary school all the way to college PhD degree. When we sum all of the effects together, we end up with the same as our highest ranking one. So in this case, college PhD. However, everything below that is simply just the sum of everything that preceded it. So elementary school has an effect by itself. Nothing precedes it, so there's nothing to add to it. Then we go to middle school. Middle school is literally just the effect of elementary school plus whatever the difference is between elementary school to middle school, and so on. So everything in here is cumulative. So what we do in the end is just assign a prior to the total effect, but then also the proportions of said total effect. Because we want to have a certain a priori estimate of how strong is the effect overall and how are the proportions distributed. And the distribution we would like to use for that is the Dirichlet distribution. The Dirichlet is a distribution for probability distributions. So now we have a distribution of distributions again, where alpha is the proportion of the total mass in the resulting distribution. So alpha is the total effect of our ordered categorical predictor. And this is all I have to say in summary for this for this very lengthy chapter, which we went through, I realize from some of the faces in the room that this may still be a bit weird. And I will fully admit, as I said earlier, some of this eludes me still, or eludes me again after I thought I had it yesterday. And I suggest we just take a quick breather and then go over into the exercises and hope that those will make it a bit more clear to all of us. And here we are with the practical exercises. And Bernd will lead us through the easy ones. Take it away.
Yeah. So I was feeling a little bit guilty of not having done homework, because like that's how German people feel when they are not doing what they are told to do. So the first question is like, what's the difference between an ordered categorical variable and an unordered one? Define and give an example of each. So ordered, the definition, at least how I formulated it, is it's like a discrete count-like variable where the order is important, though the magnitude of change between a level and its adjacent one is not necessarily similar. So we can order it like 1 is smaller than 2, smaller than 3, or the other way around, but the difference between 2 minus 1 is not equal to the difference between 3 minus 2. And the example is like the German soccer league, where we have a Bundesliga, Zweite Bundesliga, and Dritte Bundesliga, and so on. But they are, yeah, they are ordered, but they are ordered. Yes, that's exactly my example. An unordered one is also like a discrete variable. It's sort of like in our terms, it's any sort of a character thing, which is not ordered. And its example would be like color preferences, like black, white, green. That's like a typical factor, which you can't order. The second question would be then, what kind of linked function does an ordered logistic regression employ? How does it differ from an ordinary logit link? And I think it's a cumulative linked function, and it's cumulative. So this means it adds up all the odds of all levels equaling and lower than x if x is the outcome of interest. So the cumulative log link of 3 would be the log link of 3 plus log link of 2 plus log link of 1. That's how far as I got it, at least. I think that's just like adding up the lower pieces, and this time all the pieces together are also equaling the sum of its pieces. So a third easy question: when count data are zero inflated, using a model that ignores zero inflation will tend to induce which kind of inferential error? First, my impression was over-dispersion, but then I thought like that's completely crap. So I think what this is inferring to is that we can't really say where the zeros come from, our zero inflated model. So maybe they are the result of the process we are really investigating, but they can also be from like an unintended, like a hidden process or an unrespected process, so far like a bias. For example, I was thinking of like, if you go out and count your ripe chilies by being red, depending after a given amount of thermal energy they had for growing, this is like the process we want to count. But the problem could be if you are colorblind, you would not detect correctly if they are ripe or red because you're colorblind. So you get like these zero inflations by having this difficulty with your eyes.
I love that. I love that example, Bernd. That's a really nice example. Before you head off into the next question, I would actually like to propose my solution to this one, where I think the inferential error of the model which ignores the zero inflation would be that we underpredict the true outcome. So because we don't account for this additional process through which zeros may arise, in the Poisson process itself, our rate which we infer would be lower than the true rate when the Poisson process is actually in action.
Yeah, so I agree. There's like a philosophical thing going. I'll just turn on my camera. There's a philosophical thing here, right? Because if you actually what you want to predict is the average number of manuscripts, then actually ignoring zero inflation will give you the average correctly, but it'll give you the wrong distribution, right? But if you wanted to predict how good are they if I employ a strict bishop so they never get to drink, then you actually really care about this part, right? And of course, often you care about like not having too much dispersion. But like in my field, like I have missing values because my instrument sucks, right? And it sucks when there's very little to measure, right? So they're not taking, like, then it will be confounded by actually it's systematically being low. So like it depends on whether the thing you want to predict is dependent or independent of this. If the zeros are completely random, if it's just like 10% of your data set is deleted, then you will actually, just by ignoring them, you will get to the correct inference. But if there's some process that generates them that are not random, then you have to account for it.
Yes, to break that back to the example that Bernd just introduced, I think it all comes down to which question you're interested in answering. Are you interested in answering the question of how many of my my plants have ripened, or how many of my plants do I identify as having ripened? So it's the question of what is out there, what could I get from my field versus what do I actually return home with? Where a model that does not account for the zero inflation just tells us what we arrive home with, which is not the maximum yield or the actual yield of our field. All right, stolen enough of your time, Bernd, take it over again.
Yeah, I think now I'm getting like shaky with the results from now on. I'm not sure about it. So for the fourth question, I rather came up with a problem. Like the question is, over-dispersion is common in count data. Given an example of a natural process that might produce over-dispersed counts, can you also give an example of a process that might produce under-dispersed counts? And like what Eric stated in the lecture, also is written in the book, is that as soon as like counts incorporate more than one process, they tend to over-disperse. So over-dispersing, like meaning having thicker tails than expected. But I have a problem with these process, like what's a process? And can't we always like split processes into finer parts? Like net photosynthesis is always like the sum of these two cycles in there, and this can be split into the performance of each, like the enzyme pumps or the ion pumps working in these cycles. So I'm confused about when we can say that we have only one process.
I think the problem that we, especially as biologists, are facing here is that the way we think about processes is potentially very different from how more statistically minded people think about processes. So what I would assume process refers to here is the entire Poisson count producing process without any heed for the different sub processes that feed into it. So what over-dispersion actually just tells us is that if we were to stick with the photosynthesis example, and our count output would be, I don't know, number of chlorophyll pigments, because at least that's a count. So if we go with that, we could be interested in looking at the process, the entire process, which feeds into building up and generating chlorophyll A pigments. But we do so for different plants and or even different species of plant. And what the over-dispersion tells us is that these rates which produce our counts are more heterogeneous, i.e. more weight in the tails of our posterior distribution than the base Poisson distribution would expect. So the rate of chlorophyll A buildup in cacti, for example, will be on a very different rate in comparison to moss or fern.
I have a more programmer approach to answering this. So
like, try that.
Yeah. So if you have a function that takes only one variable, then that variable will follow the distribution you want it to follow, more or less, right? There can be other lame stuff, but as a first approximation, if you have a function that takes two parameters, but you only have one of them in your model, then like all of the error coming or signal coming from the other parameter is lost, and therefore your outcome will be over-dispersed. So and then like so of course, like whenever you have more predictors, like whenever more predictors are relevant to a phenomenon than you have available, then you always have over-dispersion, like more or less, right? Unless there's some magical stuff going on. And the other thing is, even if you have like the one predictor that is the only one that works, if there's like some hierarchy, as we talked about, that actually creates dispersion in that one. So like a classical one is basically, it seems like every woman has like a base rate of like how many % of her offspring will be boys, and then she gives, she gets some kids, right? And therefore, actually, how many women get like 12 males or 12 females, that is over dispersed, because it tends to be the women that actually are more prone to having females that get like 12 females in a row, and the women who are more, so there's like a level above in your model that creates this over dispersion. So these are the two processes, that either there's something in the hierarchy that introduces over dispersion, or there is more predictors that introduces over dispersion.
So in brief, like what you just said is like either we have like an unobserved variable we are not accounting so far, that's this example, and the other one is more like a norm of reaction example where like your variable, the females, all have like different inherent proportions of giving birth to either male or female children.
Yeah. So your input thing, which you think is a fixed value, is actually a distribution, and therefore you have over dispersion because it assumes that it has to come from like a fixed value for you to have the Poisson level of dispersion.
Yeah, so I got it. Thanks.
Lovely. Same goes for under-dispersion, of course, just the other way around. So this is where our rates are autocorrelated. So for example, if we run with the example of just now of proportion of female or male births, if that was an inherited trait, and we look at we look through the generations of one family tree, we would have an under-dispersed outcome because those rates are autocorrelated with each other.
That's a way better example than the one I would have used.
Well, you lined that example up for us so perfectly.
I'm too dumb to use it. So my super lame example, I actually thought was super clever, was basically like cats having territories, right? So you go up and you do some plot of land, and obviously there's like going to be like one cat in each territory, and there's very few cat territories that has like two. So therefore you have under dispersion. There's like the mean number of cats most places.
That's a really good example as well. I like that. So yeah, under dispersion just reflects that there is less heterogeneity in the different rates of our different subjects or study setups than the Poisson distribution would expect. And that comes about as autocorrelation. Autocorrelation just being one of the processes.
Yeah, and like if you're very clever, you can have autocorrelation without having over dispersion, right? Because you could have like that they go like this, so they are like correlated with the previous one, but in like globally they're not correlated. But I totally take your point. I'm just trying to be annoying.
Well, you're not managing that so far, so you better try harder. All right, Bernd, do you feel confident moving forward with the next few questions?
I at least feel, not sure about confident, but feel yes.
Okay, that sounds good, because what I can tell so far, based off of your questions and answers, we have sparked quite a few nice question answer sessions so far. And if we can keep that going for as long as possible, I would love that, because I think everyone else gets more out of this than if I just rattle down what I've got and then no one speaks up.
Yeah, I'm happy to be a little bit less advanced in the topic and show off that I'm less advanced. So
no,
sorry,
Bernd, sorry to interrupt you. I just have access to McElreath solutions. That's all it is.
So it's actually cheating.
Of course it is.
Yeah. I just started watching his lectures and he's so funny, like I need.
He's good.
Yeah, he's really excellent. If you haven't started watching the lectures, you need to. It's amazing. It's better entertainment than Netflix. So the medium question, like at a certain university, employees are annually rated from 1 to 4 on their productivity, with 1 being least productive and 4 most productive in a certain department at a certain university in a certain years. Number of employees receiving 1, compute the log cumulative odds of each rating. Maybe my internet is a little bit laggy right now. At least my computer blames it to be so. If it's broken down, just let me know. So what I
We
did,
can still hear you just fine.
Yeah, scroll up a little bit so we can see the question.
So that's basically the question. So we have a university which gets rated from 1 to 4, and these are the counts. 1 is bad and 4 is good in case of being productive, whatever this means. So what I did is I created a data frame with like a rating column and a count column. Then I realized from producing this downward that it doesn't make sense because of the data structure. So what I actually did, indeed, in between here, I create like a vector where I have just like repeated 1 to 4 according to the amounts they were counted in the department. So 12 times 1, 36 times 2, 7 times 3, and 41 times 4. And then I did what was done in the book. So I calculated these, I forgot what this variable stands for actually. I think the prior probability count. So by dividing these,
I think that should be the proportion.
Rates, the proportion, yeah, that's
yeah, a percent or whatever. Yeah, proportion I think is
yeah. And then I used these CumSum to build this cumulative predictive count. Just copied it out of the book. What we need to do, so the log of x might divided by 1 minus x. And then build the log cum odds with this logit of the logit convenience function up here. And then we come out with like these values. I'm not sure if this is correct or nice. And as I like the visualization in the book, I did like similar graph than in the book. So this is like the frequency of counts. That's of course similar to the relative proportion of counts. Then this is the cumulative proportion. So we add up each individual proportion. So there's a very small proportion of increase from the 2 to the 3. And this is the log cumulative odds with the fourth one being infinitive, so somewhere out. This should be set to 1, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, just so I can remember, the reason we transform to the log odds scale, that's to set priors, and it's because it's a better outcome scale, right?
Exactly.
Oh, sorry, continue.
Okay, no more question to this. And the second medium question is like, make a version of figure 12.5 for the employee ratings data given just above. So the data is the ones displayed here. And this figure 12.5 is the one which Eric has highlighted in yellow, where we have these bars with these yellow bars in between, showing the difference between like outcome K and K minus 1 always. So I actually did this with ggplot, and I was wondering about it, how to calculate it. If it's really just like, so each of these, the dot is each cumulative proportion at each rating 1 to 4. The gray bar also is like the cumulative proportion. And then what I did is I just subtracted this proportion minus the prior one, and did it as a,
and then shifted.
I think.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, because I wasn't really sure about it, if this is.
No, but this is exactly why you do it.
Problem. Exactly right. Nice. Nailed it.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
so the question is.
Looks good.
So the question is ridiculous. So it lines up. And the last question, my answer is no. So can you modify the derivation of the zero-inflated Poisson distribution from the chapter to construct a zero-inflated binomial distribution? So this is like doing some math stuff, is pushing formulas around. And my answer is honestly no. I gave it a try. I at least was able to copy and paste the zero-inflated Poisson thing into my R Markdown, but after this it stopped. So Eric, unfortunately, you need to take over.
All good. I am laughing because my initial reaction was also just to type no and leave it at that. I literally had the word no in my script at a point in time. Because I do not like these shift sum formula around questions.
Just
That
a long
being
time ago.
But okay,
yeah,
so
it's just
maybe this is an artifact of me not having done the exercise. So it just seems easy, right? But isn't it just like taking the formula for the binomial, slapping 1 minus p in front of it, and then taking the Bernoulli and slapping p in front of it?
I'm not quite sure because I'm not quite adept with how the Bernoulli distribution looks like. But what I've done is, first I've reminded myself of the zero inflated Poisson, where P is just the probability of no count generating process happening, and then lambda, and there's something wrong here which I need to fix in the visualization of this, are just the counts that are produced when the count producing process actually occurs. This is in turn an extension of the Poisson distribution. And when we look at what this is for non-zero observations, so this is just copy pasted from the book. When we observe zero, the probability of observing zero comes with a P0, which is the probability of no count process happening, but then also is driven by lambda. And so what this comes down to is just probability of no count process starting plus the inverse of that, so count process happens, and then just the likelihood of Poisson. And to take that over from, so just for zero observations, to go from Poisson distribution to binomial, I just took the likelihood from the Poisson distribution here, the exponential of negative lambda, and just took the likelihood from binomial distribution, which is 1 negative q to the power of n, and just exchange those two. So I feel as though building the zero inflation part for the binomial distribution for zero observations was relatively trivial on my end, where it got super duper fucking complicated for me, so much so that I had no other choice than to consult the solutions by McElraith, because I am not good at throwing around formulae, was for non-zero observations. So for non-zero observations, this is our formula, which we're running with for the zero inflated Poisson, which is just 1 minus p of nothing happens, and then another likelihood of Poisson happening, so that is likelihood of Poisson is in here, but also we have to account for the chance that if this process happens, then so this up here is just the likelihood of Poisson produces a zero, and this down here is likelihood of Poisson produces something that is not zero. And apparently the likelihood of binomial produces something that is not zero is this entire thing here. N factorial divided by y factorial, yada yada. And honestly, okay, at this point, if you've got a good explanation, Jan, please be my guest.
But like I don't have a good. So if you just go with the top one, right? Then like the Poisson one, which is the one we know is true even without cheating. Mm-hmm. Then basically the bottom one is basically if you just take the 1 minus p0, if you take that away, it's just the total normal Poisson distribution. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just the Poisson distribution, and it's just 1 minus p is the probability we use the Poisson distribution, and we don't have to do anything with the fact that it's sometimes zero, because we have given y larger than 0, so we don't have to take we don't have to take into account that this function can actually evaluate the number 0. because we're ignoring that by the conditional part. And then when you
I see it now. Yeah. No, sorry, please do go on. It just light bulb happened for me. Please do go on.
Exactly. And then when you go to the Bernoulli one, the binomial one, then the top one is again there. We have to take into account that the binomial sometimes returns 0. So we have to take to slap in so it's p0, easy peasy, and then the tough part is this. Then it's 1 minus p because that's the probability of being in Bernoulli land instead of in zero inflated land. And then this 1 minus qn, that is basically just going down in the stuff. So the stuff you have on the bottom, that is just the total normal vanilla binomial distribution with 1 minus p in front of it, right? And here you just have like when y is 0, that's basically when you like that's basically the case that you should shove up to the given 0, right? And n exclamation mark divided by y exclamation, so 0 exclamation mark 0 is 1, right? And n minus 0 is n. So it's n exclamation mark divided by it's n factorial divided by n factorial, so that dies. And then you have q to the y power, and again y is 0, so that dies. So you just have 1 minus q to the power of n minus y, and y is again 0. So you're only stuck with 1 minus q to the nth power. And I presume, yes, exactly. That's what we have up there in the 0 one.
Yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. That light bulb moment was so good. Bernd, did you just have that light bulb moment as well? Not quite yet?
Partially.
Yeah, no, it's literally just so basically these parts are in the non-zero observation formulae following the 1 minus p0 are just the base Poisson distribution or the base binomial distribution. And to go from there to and now we do this for the 0 observations, we just plug in to set y to be 0, and then so much just drops out.
Yeah, and then we end up in the line above.
Yeah. So for example, lambda to the power of 0 is 1, and we divide that by 1. So these just drop out, and we are left with exponential of negative lambda. And that's our 0 observation likelihood in the Poisson model.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jan. This was tremendous. All right, moving over to the hard exercises. There were quite a few of these, and I feel as though what McElraith means by hard exercises at this point is just, and now please code stuff. Because I personally, so for me, this was the hardest exercise by far. Everything after that was a lot easier.
I think
for
as with most teachers, where everything is easy, he's just like, how long time did it take me to make the exercise? That's like how he determines difficulty.
Yes, I think that is it. So for practice H1, the question is, and should I blow this up a bit more? Probably. So practice H1 just says that in 2014, the paper was published that was entitled Female Hurricanes Are Deadlier Than Male Hurricanes, as the title suggests, yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to read the entire thing out. You can read that for yourself, both in the book and on my blog. I'm just going to quickly summarize this. What he wants from us is to run a model, a Poisson model, that tries to understand how many people have died in any given hurricane, given how feminine the name of said hurricane was, and then try to understand which storms are fit well or are fit poorly, i.e. retrodicted. So first, I prepared a data. We already have loaded the data. I just saved that to D, and then I standardize the femininity of the names, just so that I can set priors a bit more easily. Because
what is femininity? Is Sarah a more feminine name than like Jessie, or is it like how?
Exactly, that beats me. I do not know how they came up with it. The data is in the data set. I assume Olga is less feminine than Elizabeth. I guess I have this is stuff where I'm just lost, but I take the numbers and run with it. Then I just combine the data into a list where we get D for the defs and F for the standardized femininity. And now that we have the standardized data, we can simply just build a model. So the model I am suggesting so far is just to have deaths be Poisson distributed with lambda as the rate of deaths, where log distribution of lambda, we need to use the log link because we're running a Poisson model, is driven by an intercept. So on average, all storms are causing this many deaths. And then we have the effect of femininity, standardized femininity, that is. And because both priors are in log space, because they're feeding into the log link over here, 0 corresponds to an outcome of 1. So a rate of 1. Doesn't necessarily mean that we've got a terrifyingly good prior here, but I'm just assuming that there may be an effect of around 1 more death per increase of femininity in 1 standard deviation. Is that a good prior? Is it not? Difficult to judge, because we are now talking about log space with standardized data. So I just want to do a prior predictive simulation. So just as we've done before, I do the prior predictive simulation. I do that with a femininity sequence ranging from -2 to 2, because we've got standardized data and hardly anything falls outside of the space between -2 and 2. So outside of 4 standard deviations across the entire board. And what you can see here, these are the priors that I end up with. I think those priors are pretty decent. We allow for positive as well as negative trends, so our data can tell us which one of these are actually valid, but we don't have a lot of explosive trends in our data. There are a few of these, but to be honest, I find these strong trends to be unintuitive. I also find the weak trends unintuitive, because I find it unintuitive that femininity of a name of a hurricane should drive how many people die from it. And I am just ready to have the data overwhelm my priors. So I just proceed with these and I run my model. And I finally figured out how I can get my blog post to not show the sampling of the chains. And that's just by adding this cause argument. And I'm so happy about it, because now on the right-hand side, the scroll bar is a much more accurate representation of how much we've got left. And I know it's still a lot. Don't worry about it. We'll get through it. When we then look at our outputs, what we can see here is that we have, on average, there's a positive relationship between femininity and death toll, which we are actually relatively certain of. But which of those hurricanes did we actually identify correctly? So for this, I just plot the raw data from my data objects, and then I add my predictions. Where my predictions are literally just in the sequence from -2 to 2 of standardized femininity. And then I just do the link to predict the deaths, then get my mean prediction, get the prediction intervals, put that trend on here. So this is a really, really tiny gray interval in this plot, which is so small you can hardly see it in here. I then also compute the sampling prediction to get the sampling or the posterior of my different parameters, slap that on here too. And what you can see is that there are quite a few storms which we did not predict well. And those are the ones over here, also the ones over here. This model is not doing so hot. And without going into this too far, what I want to say here is literally just that our model does not retrodict many of the hurricanes well, even though it's quite certain of its predictions, which is highlighted by this relatively narrow band right here. And quite obviously, that just tells us that this model of hurricane death, as driven by standardized femininity, has some issues. And I think that many of these probably come from this right-hand side of the plot, which is quite indicative of over-dispersion, as we can see a lot more variation here than our model can account for and does account for. And I also think that I suggest that the positive trend, which we have identified, which is pretty weak, I might add, might just be an artifact of these outliers on the right-hand side. So I took the extra step to look at Pareto K values for each of our different storms to understand whether some of these are highly influential. Keep in mind, Pareto K values of greater than 1 are usually indicative of highly influential data points. So I run that, save it as a data frame, plotted with the stat half-I function, and I can see that while most of our data points actually have reasonable Pareto K values, there are some which are quite heavily pulling our parameter estimate for BF, the parameter linking standardized femininity to depth total. So infomercial style, there has to be a better way. And luckily, question 2 is exactly about that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask. Sorry.
Yeah, so counts are nearly always over-dispersed relative to Poisson, is what this question starts with. So now we are tasked to fit a gamma Poisson.
I have one philosophical thing. Basically, when you looked at the previous one, you had like basically either it was like a feminine name or a masculine name, which is why you had like a lot of stuff around the 1 and a lot of stuff about negative 1.5, right? So wouldn't it be more sensible to actually fit a model for like the stuff over here and a model for the stuff over here instead of like one that like has a super weird intercept that crosses this no man's land in the middle?
Yes, and we're getting there. We're literally building up to that.
I've just checked the names used in this hurricane thing, and I'm wondering if maybe like Alex is a name in this no man's land, which could have like 0 femininity. Like,
good point. Yeah, good point. Thank you for checking that. So let's look at practice question H2. Here, because of the over-dispersion, we are now tasked with fitting a gamma Poisson. And then just show that the over-dispersed model no longer shows as precise a positive association between femininity and depths. And now, can we explain why this association has diminished in strength? So this is, does our new model still show that trend? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? So again, I have written these answers so they can stand by themselves. So I load the library again, load the data, standardize my femininity score, make my data set, and now I fit my model. And the model is the exact same as before, just this time I am slapping a gamma Poisson distribution on this, and a gamma Poisson needs both a lambda as well as a scale parameter, but the scale parameter having to be strictly positive, hence why I'm just slapping an exponential function of 1 onto it. And this scale parameter just tells us how much weight should we put on the tails of our lambda distribution, right? So we move on. We look at the output of this, of Precis, and immediately we can tell that femininity still has a positive association with depth toll. However, we are really not all that sure of how strong that effect is, or even which side of 0 that effect lies on. Personally, if I saw this model, I would strongly argue that this model still shows an overall positive effect because
me too.
A large chunk lies above 0.
There's an 80% chance that it's above 0 or something like that, right?
Yeah. So
given the model, important caveat.
Yes, a model which certainly is not perfect, and we'll get to how we make it better in the next few questions. And so if we just plot the coefficients of the two different models against each other, you can see the second model, which is the one with the gamma Poisson distribution always on top. And this last one here is just scale. So for the scale parameter, you can see that there was none for the first model because it didn't have a gamma Poisson distribution. But you can also see how the uncertainty of our estimates has just gotten so much bigger. So this is the reason why we have this overlap with 0 and why we are much less certain of our association between femininity and depths if we were to report it. However,
there's also something scary here that when you have a sucky model, it's very sure. It's like that doesn't jive well with me.
Yeah, it's all about those visual inspections after the fact at this point.
Are these uncertainties, are they like the uncertainties from the likelihood, or are they only the uncertainty in the like that comes from the regression coefficients?
That's just the posterior. So that is just samples of the posterior, and then taking the center 89% of mass.
Okay.
I'll move on. We circle back to that if it remains a question. Okay. Cool. So before I get into trying to understand where this uncertainty comes from, what about the predictions of this new model? Does this do any better at fitting our data? Because yes, uncertainty, nice and all, but do we actually get better predictions? That's what I'm interested in. Because honest reporting of uncertainty is nice, but if the model is still shit at predicting, what good is the uncertainty? It just tells me that I don't know anything about this. So again, I just do same prediction plot as I did last time around, so I'm not going to explain this. And you can see that, yeah, the uncertainty shows up, but we still don't predict most of our storms quite that well. And we still have quite the outliers.
The dotted line is the uncertainty of around, like that's the over-dispersion. And the dark one is basically the uncertainty on the mean, right?
Yes. So at this point, as I say in the text myself, what's there left to say other than look at the increased uncertainty of our model? Because that's all we've gained so far. Nothing more. No better predictions, nothing. But for now,
well, I guess it has better predictions, right? Because it's less surprised about the outliers because they're only like twice as far away as you would expect instead of like 100 times as far away as you expect. I'm pretty sure if you do the Pareto thing and compare those two models, the over-dispersed model will have like way better leave one out cross-validation thingy.
Yes, no
because
doubt.
It's not. Yeah.
What I'm getting at here is if someone in a government position tasks you with predicting the death toll of the next storm, I would not trust either of those models. I would just always go into full-on flee for your lives. And probably Sam knows a bit more about that with his family in Florida.
Yeah, but like I'm guessing this model will say the next one has up to 100 people dying, and the previous one said up to 10. So this one is like way better.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Just with this model, we would also say, but it could also be anything from 50 to 170. So yes, on average, the predictions are better, but I feel as though they're just marginally better. My point being just, it's still a shit model, and I don't like it. Please get it off of my blog. So this is the point where I would like to turn to the conceptual part of this exercise again. We have demonstrated that yes, what was suggested should happen, happened. We now have an overlap of the 89% PI with 0. We are much less certain of our association between femininity and death toll. But where does the uncertainty come from? And the uncertainty comes from the underlying gamma distribution. So what I do here is for 3 different values of femininity, I pull gamma distributions following our linear model with the inverse link applied to it, and then also taking the scale for 100 samples from our posterior. So I'm taking what's in the posterior, what our model has sampled. I'm taking the first 100 of these, and I'm just going through and building the gamma distribution for each of these. And this is where it gets tricky again. And this took me quite a while, and I'm not sure I can accurately represent that today again. But gamma distributions are sorry, so I'm just going to read this out here. These are gamma distributions, which are samples from the posterior distribution of death rates when assuming same femininity and so on. This is a distribution sampled from another distribution. So we've taken the distribution that is the posterior, and from that, we have sampled the gamma distribution. And because of this added distribution on a distribution, we get more uncertainty in our model. And especially because these distributions have an additional parameter, the scale parameter, the combinations of alpha, beta F, and scale are much more manifold to arrive at any given combination that results in a gamma distribution, which is consistent with the data, than a basic Poisson distribution, which just has lambda, which we informed through alpha and beta f, which is still consistent with the data. So we have two factors at play here. One is we have an additional parameter in our model, which can give us just much more uncertainty. And also we have a distribution sampled from a distribution for each of our hurricanes, which then results in added uncertainty and much more potential combinations of all of our different parameters to arrive at something that's consistent with the data.
So is this just visualizing the uncertainty that was otherwise intrinsic but wasn't being shown?
Yes. This is literally just the gamma distributions, which show us the spread, which then results in the uncertainty for the first 100 posterior observations.
Well, it does a good job. It shows uncertainty.
Yeah.
I think
Sorry,
what we
Jan,
can,
you muted.
It also shows, like, I'm very weak in the gamma distribution. I've never used it. Like, I've used it indirectly, chi-squared, but that's like a cop-out. So, like, the way I read your plot here is the one to the right has, like, it jumps around much more, right? And I'm assuming that's the girl names.
Yes.
Right. So it basically says that it's like there's over-dispersion happening about the female names, and that's because there's more outliers that are female names, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But I still don't fully I don't understand why this works. Like, I don't, probably because I don't fully understand the gamma distribution.
So for me, sorry, Bernd, you had something before I step in.
yeah, just maybe it works also here, like the uncertainty for our model is the smallest at the mean of the model, which is femininity equals 0, which is like the center of it, if I get it right. So even if we have a high level of uncertainty, it's still like doing a thing which all models should do, like have the lowest uncertainty at its center, its mean.
Like, all models shouldn't do that. Like, all linear models does that, but obviously this model should be least sure about the middle, since like there's no names in there, right? It's only because it's aligned. It has to be like it has to, you know, cross through the middle. Like logically, it should be most uncertain there.
Yeah. I think, Jan, what your question boils down to is simply just that we integrate the spread of all of these different gamma distributions together, and then we then integrate the spread of the spreads to get up to our uncertainty. Whereas in a basic Poisson model, we would just take the spread of individual values from the posterior rather than distributions. And because those distributions have uncertainties themselves or spreads themselves, our overall uncertainty or variation skyrockets. So I think
of course,
I think this isn't
always have more
a gamma
uncertainty than
issue.
fixed point. But like, yeah, I said, but like I don't like why even a gamma, right? Like, why not some other, like, why not a normal distribution? I don't like there's something fundamental here I don't understand.
Right. I think we just take a gamma because people like that for rates. Let me take a quick look at my notes and see if I noted something down for gamma distributions. Yeah, gamma distribution. Gamma distribution is informed by lambda, which is the overall rate, which comes in here as a sample from the posterior. So this is this entire part. That's just our linear model, which gives us the overall rate. And then the variance, which is that phi I mentioned earlier, which must be positive. So that's the scale parameter here. And the closer that is, the closer it is to the Poisson distribution. So we're taking the gamma distribution, just to get back to what we talked about earlier, we're taking the gamma distribution because we want to allow for more weight in the tails.
Yeah, like I'm there like 30%, and I think that has to be good enough because it will take me a long time to fully get this.
Fair enough. We'll save that for potentially after we talked about why subtract in the log cumulative odds. All right, finally, I look again at some Pareto K values for this model. And interestingly enough, there are no outliers here, Pareto K-wise. So this fits much better than before in terms of which points are identified as highly influential potential outliers. That being said, I still think that the model could do a bit better. And this is where we get to.
And this was just the over-dispersed model. This has nothing to do with the gamma stuff, right? This Pareto thing, right?
Yeah, this is just our second model, which has the gamma distribution in it.
Wait, which had the gamma distribution?
So yes, this is the gamma distribution one. So to flip back to the previous model, this is the base one where over-dispersion was an issue. And you can see how we've got some highly influential outliers.
Yes. I'm totally clear.
Okay, cool. And when we just take the gamma distribution, so gamma Poisson distribution, to account for those outliers, we can see how that works because we have much lower Pareto K values.
Okay. I think I'm slowly getting here. Okay, so when we did it as an over, I'm just an idiot. So when we did the over-dispersed Poisson model, we actually just did a gamma model. So gamma is just an over-dispersed Poisson.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm an idiot. I confused myself. I'm sorry.
Okay, cool. Fantastic. Moving on to question H3. In order to infer a strong association between depth and femininity, it's necessary to include an interaction effect. In the data, there are two measures of a hurricane's potential to cause death: damage norm and minimum pressure. Consult hurricanes, yada, yada, yada. What we are tasked to do here is simply just build models with interaction effects between femininity and damage norm and minimum pressure, and maybe even an interaction effect between those two. I didn't go to that length. And then just look at what our models predict and whether those effect sizes are plausible. So to start this off, again, I load the data, I standardize femininity, I build my data set, but then I also put in standardized minimum pressure and standardized damage norm. The data is now ready and I am prepared to fit my model. The first model I fit is just one that includes femininity and minimum pressure, but also an interaction between femininity and minimum pressure, as you can see right here in building our gamma Poisson model. So we're still running with a gamma Poisson model because we know over-dispersion needs to be accounted for in this setup. And this is simply just my model that I'm running with. I'm running with the exact same price as I used previously. Yes.
Sorry, Eric, I ask a quick question. When you code something with that asterisk for an interaction, sometimes it nests the main effects and the interaction within that. Does it do that within the
it doesn't do that in Stan. It doesn't do that in Stan. It does that in base R, because R is trying to be clever for you, and that confuses a lot of people. In Stan, as far as I know at least, you have to specify the presence of the additive effects by themselves, even when you do the asterisk.
Gotcha, that's super helpful, thank you. I wanted to clear that up.
Cool. So in comparison to base R, in base R, you can also write out the interaction effect and just the interaction effect with that dot above the other dot, the colon, and then do the additive effect by itself if you want to. And this is basically the same, just instead of colon, you do the asterisk. Good point, though. Really good point. So
the multiply sign just means multiply. It doesn't mean like all of the combinations.
Yeah. So now I look at the persist output, and as we can see here, as the minimum pressure gets lower, so that is, we are looking at BP, that is pressure, our storms cause more deaths. That is because the lower the pressure in a storm, the more damaging it is. That's just how it's measured. So quite obviously, the lower the pressure in the storm, the more severe the storm, hence the more people die, which is then reflected by this negative association here between minimum pressure, and depth toll. So now we look at BF. BF is still estimated to be non-zero, positive, and quite certain positive. Which, again, femininity here, and I'm not saying this, I'm just saying this about femininity in this data set about hurricane names, rears its ugly head. So we need to somehow account for this a bit more. This time, we also look at the interaction effect between femininity and minimum pressure, which is a positive effect, which we are also quite certain of is actually positive. However, I failed to fully explain this one, so I just want to plot again. And so what I plot is just a P sequence, which is just the pressure sequence, from roughly where the standardized values lie in the data set, which is roughly -3 to 2. I then calculate for masculine storms, where I just set femininity to -1, do my link, then do the same for feminine storms, where I set femininity to 1, do my link from my actual model with the new data, and plot all of this with masculine storms in gray and feminine storms in red. And we can see how our model overall predicts male storms to be on average, for the most part of the range, less deadly than feminine ones. However, as pressure drops towards the right-hand side, these differences become smaller and smaller. So the lines grow closer and closer together. Some of these storms here are quite evidently influencing our model much more so than others. So I would argue that these two storms right here, as well as this storm and this storm, these feminine ones I've plotted right here, which is the raw data, are really pulling up the predictions for feminine storm death rates. Which, by the way, great name for a metal band, just putting that out there. So if we now look at our Pareto-K values again for this model, we can see that we do have some outliers again, which really do pull our model. And if we were to go into the data set, identify the names for these storms, then identify the Pareto-K values for each storm individually, I bet you really good money that these two storms are certainly some of the ones that come up. Yeah.
There's one thing that's annoying, right? If we were not smart, like if we were not smart enough to know a priori that it's kind of dumb that these feminine things are more dangerous, then like I actually think now that you got these extra predictor variables and they didn't kill the effect, they just attenuated it. That would like if I was not like if I didn't have like a Cauchy machine here that would like a priori assign it like a very low probability, then I would like be forced to just say, well, obviously female storms are just more dangerous. It's like even when you correct for like the pressure thingy, it still pans out.
I think while this material really teaches us a lot about statistics, it also teaches us the value of having expert knowledge to scrutinize your statistics.
Yeah, because like I would have a very narrow fire on this section.
All right, so Pareto-K values show up with something quite influential again. Cool. Let's just leave it at that for now. So let's turn to the second variable, where we now add damage norm, the damage caused by each storm. And I am doing so by dropping minimum pressure altogether. I'm just doing one model with an interaction effect with femininity and minimum pressure, and one model with femininity and storm damage. So I run that. And then what we can see is that as storms are more destructive, more people die. That was to be expected. And now the effect of femininity has really dropped to where it's almost completely arbitrary. And I would not report this effect as anything meaningful personally.
I agree.
So what has happened here? Again, let's just plot this bad boy. So I just plot this with a range of where my standardized damage potential lies. And that's not a good model. It's definitely a better model than what we had before, because this time we are trying to correlate damage that a storm is causing with depth toll, which of course that's going to be a really good combination.
It's like almost
logically. But also, yeah, it is. But also, if anyone asks us to predict how many people will die in a given storm,
Yeah, just
and
tell
we
me
tell
how
them,
much
well,
property
tell me how
destruction is.
damaging it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a bit circular, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And so this wouldn't be a useful tool for people who might be interested in this in government agencies or
causal inference.
Yeah, this is very much after the effect, kind of Captain Hindsight stuff.
Yeah.
So we can clearly see that our model now makes much less of a distinction between male and female storms. And I would argue that is because of the strikingly strong effect that damage severity has.
Yeah.
And that just overpowers the effect that those few outliers of storms in the male or feminine category might have. There are still quite obviously some highly influential outliers.
Yeah. One thing that would be interesting is obviously like the damage and the death toll is super correlated, but they're not like perfectly correlated, right? And since the overhype result is this female name thing, it should definitely also track with the damage, not just the death. So actually just having the damage as a predictor variable and see if the female naming thing still holds up is also a way to try to challenge the assumption.
True. So that's it for this one. And we just move on to practice H4, which I think is the second or third to last. I think actually it's the third to last. This hurricane example went on for quite a long time. So in the original hurricane paper, storm damage norm was used directly. This assumption implies that mortality increases exponentially. So basically, just what he wants us to do is now do the same thing again, but this time do log damage norm to highlight how the damage increase from one order of magnitude to the next is not linear, the way that storms are recorded in their severity. So we do all of this. I now run with standardized log transformed damage output of a storm for my model, fit the exact same model again, then just do a model comparison, where now the second model, the one that uses the log transformed and then standardized damage, wins out quite clearly when comparing the two models, with MH4 being the one I just explained and MH3B being the one we looked at previously. So model MH4 clearly outperforms the earlier non-logarithmic model MH3B. But how do the parameter estimates look in comparison? Here they are. Our log transformed model, which is the one on top, shows us that the effect of storm severity actually increased, whereas the effect of female name actually decreased. But again, both of these overlap zero so much that I would not want to report this effect at all to begin with. So our parameters still show that femininity shouldn't really have an effect here, but it is severity of the storm that really has the effect. The interaction effect also decreased a tiny bit, probably not that strong, maybe not even worth reporting, to be honest. So with the log transformed input, how do our predictions look like? Again, I build a sequence this time of the standardized log transformed range of our damage outputs. I run through the whole predicting of data part again. And when we look at the output, this is a model that I'm quite rather happy with at this point, because this accurately predicts many of our hurricanes to quite a good extent. There are still some outliers, probably these three are ones, and maybe even this one as well. So potentially these four are ones that I would highlight myself and probably want to investigate a bit further and potentially even drop from the model. This model fits much better, still not perfect, but much better. And I would assume that these outliers are simply just an artifact of the data set not being ginormous.
Yeah, or the fact that like if it hits a city, it kills a lot more people than if it hits like a rural area. So it just has like a really like a low probability of like basically following a different model, right? And that's why you need to have over-dispersion.
Also, if all of these four storms, for example, had the same management team in charge in the government who critically underestimated what was about to happen. Then afterwards they got fired, so they don't show up anymore. That's a hidden state which we don't see in here.
Yeah, I think it's always dangerous to remove data. You just like find something that has fat tails, but still like the t-distribution is really good, right? Because it can have fat tails and still like a narrow middle thing, right? So this is like these distribution that has like very far out fat tails, but like still has like a large chunk in the middle. Those should be able to save your data while still actually being like not cherry picking your data.
Yeah. Well, it might have been interesting to going back to the model to put D itself. No. Yeah, we've got the gamma Poisson. We've ran with that from the beginning.
Okay.
But we may have wanted to increase our exponential, so our scale prior, to get to even fatter tails.
I should just have like but like there's a fair amount of data points. I don't think like even if you wrote 10 there, I don't think it would change a lot.
No, but quite honestly, the model fits quite well.
Yeah, but like what's the posterior and the scale? Because like if the scale is like way less than 1, like it doesn't really help to make like very fat scales because you still have a lot of probability around 1.
Posterior on the scale is around 1.
Yeah, right. So I think like having like a wider prior on that will hardly make a difference.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean a wider prior on the scale. I meant a prior shifted further to the right-hand side, because the scale parameter, the higher that gets, the flatter the Poisson gets, the gamma Poisson gets.
Yes. Okay. We're talking. I'm not understanding. Like, so let's say you pick like a half Cauchy 10. So now you have like we both love the Cauchy. That's like very very fat tail, right? So if the true gamma, the true scale is like a 10 billion, like that Cauchy is just gonna say spot on. That has a lot of probability around it. I will just grant you that one. Where the exponential will not, right? It has like 0 probability at a million, right?
Yeah.
But since like it's like if the true things was like some large number, it would start walking towards that large number, even with like a narrower prior. So the fact that it's like it's 1 and not like 10 or 15 suggests that it unfortunately like it doesn't really like, no matter how wide you make the prior, like it will still be tallest around 0, right? And then taper off, and therefore it will still have a maximum likelihood estimate like close to 1, and like the number of data points are like 100, not like 2, right? So the data like beats the prior very very easily.
Yes, depending on how strong we make the prior, because the data set isn't all that big. So yes, what I was suggesting was just slapping on a really strong prior and see what happens.
Okay. Then of course, if you a strong prior on the number larger than, but then you have to like specifically say, I think it's like 4.
Yeah.
And then just put the prior there, right? You can't have like a fat tail prior, because then it'll walk back to 1.
Yeah, basically make a uniform distribution between 3.99 and 4.01.
Yeah, and then it's gonna pick 3.99, right? It's gonna pick the lowest of those, because that's where the but okay, and that will of course like by definition make it more over-dispersion. But there must be better distribution. There must be like some like we're just not smart enough, right? Some gamma squared.
I think we'll probably get to that when we talk about hierarchical models next week, the week after next week. Moving on to the second to last question, practice H5. You can see there were a lot of hard questions this time, but they weren't really that hard. So one hypothesis from developmental psychology, usually attributed to blah, 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 proposes that women and men have different average tendencies and moral reasoning. Again, blah, 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 blah. Evaluate this hypothesis using the trolley data, supposing that contact provides a proxy for physical harm, which, according to the hypothesis, female participants of a survey are usually inclined to vote against. Are women more or less bothered by contact than are men in these data? Figure out the models that is or are needed to address this question.
Yeah. I would just like to say, like another hypothesis, like how cool you are with people pushing random people on track. Might not track with your gender, but just with like how strong you are at opposing somebody pushing you on a track, right? So like a puny guy like me might be in the women category, because like if a big guy pushes me, I'm also screwed.
You feel as though if you tried to push the other person, they would just pick you up for your own.
Okay. I said I'm pushing the fat guy, and he just lifts me up and like throws me on the track.
Yeah. So I load the rethinking library here. I extract the data. I then extract the response, the action, the intention, the contact to build the models as they were discussed in the book. I build the gender index variable. And now for the model. I just use the same model skeleton as was provided in the book. And then this time around, I just order my cut points together with the gender. So I want cut points for each gender separately. And so what I do
There's
is
only two, right? Or is it like a really fancy data set?
No, so I want an estimate of a parameter for each. So that's what I mean by cut points. For each of my parameters, I want a version for females and one for males.
Yeah.
So what I do is I do my ordered logistic model with phi being based off of this model skeleton, which I showed you in the slides earlier, which is also in the book and also in the lecture on YouTube. Then I just set some priors here. But the important thing I want to highlight is this part, A times F. This is where all of the magic happens, because F is simply just a field which identifies whether our participant is female or not. And with this tiny bit of magic, all of these different parameters show up, which tell us that overall for A, so this is A for males just drops out. So overall, with A, the main effect of being female on cumulative log odds, on average, women have moral qualms about the trolley problem. They do not like the trolley problem at all. At least the ones who were sampled here don't. That's just simply how to read this. Now for BC2, which is the interaction effect of being female in contact scenario as opposed to BC1. So BC is just contact scenario. Contact is happening. So this is physical harm as was defined in our hypothesis earlier. And now what I want to do is simply just look at the parameter of BC1 and of BC2, where BC2 is the females and BC1 is the males. And I want to understand who is more opposed to the contact scenario. Is it the males or the females? And in this case, it is actually the men who are more opposed to it. This is important to highlight because this hypothesis, I think, simplifies a lot of things to just say, oh, women don't like to push people. But in our data sets, people are so much more than just their gender. Hence why trying to answer a hypothesis like this is absolutely null and void with a data set like this, because there are so many confounding variables that you just cannot account for it. And you would probably also want a much, much, much larger sample size, which is much more representative of the different cultural groups on Earth. So all in all, junk science is what we've just done.
I don't fully agree. It's like I agree. It's like sometimes there's like causal salad going on, right? And therefore you're screwed, right? But and like of course like these are like Western educated, all of those, I totally agree. But like at least within that group, like most likely they are like representative female college students and representative male college students. So like I would at least defend that within this weird group, like there are not many like confounders.
I will say that within this group, of course, our model holds true. But what we're interested in is what happens in the wider world. And I do not agree that this model can be or should be used to generalize beyond just the data set.
I am like 70% in agreement with you. I'm like,
okay, hear me out.
Yeah, I would regress the effect like a factor of 5 towards the mean and say this is what I would believe in the general population, and then I would like double the standard deviation, and then most likely like now there's no effect. But like if I had to guess an effect, I would guess that would be the effect, right?
So basically, you end up saying, "Well, I don't know, but there seems to be a super weak effect."
Yes, like
right.
Like I'm like 55% chance this is true. Right? That's what I'm going with.
So hear me out before Sam gets to speak, as I see you've unmuted yourself.
I'm enjoying this. This is like a whole social commentary on some BS data. I'm loving this.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything.
So where I'm coming from, I think that the moral compass of each individual person is informed by so many factors that any data set which does not sample a vast majority of the overall population which we're interested in, or takes really, really minute care to account for all of the different confounds which might be present, should not be used for generalization to the population level here. Because if we were to try to draw a DAG which forms into your moral compass, that DAG is way too complex for the data that we have. So take for example, neighborhood in which you grew up. That will certainly influence your moral compass. With the trolley problem in particular, have you ever seen someone get run over by a train? Will probably heavily influence whether you are ready to push someone in front of it. It's all of these different lived experiences that form together to define the ultimate outcome here, that I think gender is much too heavy a shortcut to be taken with the data that we have.
So again, I'm like 7 to 80% like totally on your team, right?
I got you to 80. I got you to 80.
Yeah. No, yes, I'm updating. No, like so like what when we get to hierarchical models, right? Then there's like you could imagine there's like this is like all of the population, and then you draw subpopulations from there, and like one of them would be like this the weird people at college, right? And like you could repeat this experiment 40 times at different places, right? And then like sometimes get like I guess like maybe female engineers hate like are squishy and female doctors are not squishy or whatever, right? It's like or the other way around, right? And then you have like a bunch of like some population where the effect is large, some population where the effect is small, et cetera. And then you have like a overarching distribution where you draw these different subpopulations. And that's obviously that distribution I would actually buy as a proxy for like the distribution as a whole. So if you actually just went out and did like this on like, you did it like with doctors, you did it with like postal workers, you just took like 20 different like groups and like split them into females and males and did this experiment. Sure, there's like all kinds of other confounders. Like I'm totally with you there. But like if you then just said like what is what is the distribution that like all these subpopulations comes from? If that distribution itself is also skewed, such that you can like the adaptive prior. If that one is like exclude 0 in either way, then I actually think I would like be inclined to buy it. Even though there's other like sure maybe it's not true in like race car drivers or whatever, right? Like I haven't sampled all the populations, but like if I have sampled like 20 populations where I can like split on sex and there's not too much selection effect in like who goes into these studies, like if I've actually gotten like a large survey, like there's a lot of caveats, right? Then I would actually be willing to buy it.
Yes, I think what this comes down to is we're talking about slightly different questions which we're trying to answer. And your explanation, I am actually 100% with you there, because what you're doing in your setup is you are reducing the reach of the hypothesis to say instead of all women are this and all men are this, you're saying on average, women and men in these professions or with these educational backgrounds behave like this, which is reducing the problem by multiple orders of magnitude.
Yeah, but with the caveat that I'm actually trying to push it back up to an adaptive prior that covers all the subpopulations, and then trying to make inference on that one.
Right. Yes, you will end up with a model that's quite good at prediction, but the overall effect of femininity or femaleness on your morality will probably be masked much more by your educational level.
Yeah, but like let's just run some quick thought experiments. Like if 19 out of 20 of the sub experiments I've done in vastly different subpopulations, if those come out like this one, with females being less squishy, I think it was, then like you would most likely be somewhat inclined to believe that there's something going on here.
Yes, you certainly would be. But I think the big point, which is why we're still discussing this, is because we are approaching it from opposite ends. You're approaching it, if I understand you correctly, from the end of I want to build the most accurate model I can. Whereas I'm approaching it from the, so now we have the model, can we report this? And on the report side of things, especially with what can happen when reporting these gender-based findings, I would always be very careful, because you can do a lot more harm than good very, very easily. So I would not want to make sweeping generalizations like these.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, like when I construct examples, just that 19 of them are like it pans out, right? That's probably not what would happen. Like if we actually did this 19, like I'll gladly grant that. So like most likely, if we went out, did the experiment 21, we will find out that this one is actually the most extreme effect, and there's like nothing going on in the rest of it. Like that's probably what happened. I'm just saying, like if this one is actually representative, when you start drawing from different subtopics, then I would surrender to the data.
Fine, I can agree to that. I still am reminding you though that I got you to 80%.
Yep.
All right, last question, guys. And then this is, by the way, the longest session we've had so far, and I am not tired of it yet. I'm actually having the time of my life right now. This is really nice, and thank all of you for sticking around for this. It's nice to have you on board with this, even if we're running for 2 hours plus. So last question, practice H6. The data in fish records visitors to a national park, and we are now tasked with modeling a zero inflated Poisson for the number of fish caught with a certain number of variables, which we can pick ourselves and then build models ourselves from the data set. I didn't build multiple models, I just built one model and I was done with it because I wanted to go to bed. So what I do is I load the data, I then look at the data, and the data gives me fish caught, my response variable, which is Poisson distributed, then whether live bait was used, then whether a person camped overnight in the national park, then how many people were in a party of observed peoples, then we have whether a person was a child or not, and then we have hours spent fishing. So I want to actually build a model that includes all of these, because I can see a relation with all of these to fish being caught. So fish caught is our response variable. Live bait is where I suggest that live bait doesn't have anything to do with whether you fish or not, but it has everything to do with how many fish you catch, with live bait netting you more fish being caught once you already do fish. Now, whether you're a camper or not, to my understanding, or at least my assumption, would mean that you stay overnight, it's a long evening, you don't have anything better to do, you go fishing. So you are a camper, which should, to my intuition, increase the chance of you going fishing, but not necessarily interact with the number of fish you catch. Now I look at persons, and I argue that however many people you are doesn't affect whether you go fishing or not, but the more people fish, the more fish will be caught. Second to last, I look at the child variable. I would argue that being a child should actually determine both whether you fish. I assume children fish less. Definitely personal bias. I hated fishing as a child. I'm still not the biggest on it, but I detested it, all capital letters. So that's where my personal bias shines through, and we'll see if my prior will be overwhelmed by the data. And I also assume that they are less effective than the adults at fishing, because they just don't have the reaction time or the speed at which, or the power to reel some fish in, especially the bigger ones. And or they may get all finicky when that glibbery thing is in their hands and then they drop in. You can tell I'm talking from experience here. Lastly, we go to hours. I would argue that how long you fish does not determine whether you fish, because by default, that can't be the case. But how long you fish determines how many fish you catch. I assume that I should log transform this because of the diminishing returns the longer you fish. Because going from 0 hours of fishing to 1 hour of fishing will net you on average so many more potentially caught fish than going from 200 hours on end fishing to 201 hours of on end fishing. So let me fit that.
The outcome is fish caught, and that's like a number, right?
Yes.
Shouldn't you expect, like, if you fish twice as long, you catch twice as many fish? So you shouldn't log transform it.
Yes, I can see that. It's just to me what I think is I always expect fishing to net you some returns, but then as soon as fish catch on to the fact that over there some shit is going down and one of my compatriots is thrashing around in the water, I'm not going to go back there for a while. You will see these diminishing returns.
I think that argues for having it both like on the normal scale and on the log scale, so you can capture both effects. But I take your point.
I think there are good points being to be made for both, to be honest. And now it would be interesting to run both models and see which one functions better. I just didn't bother with it.
No, like this model, like you would have to think really long and hard if you wanted it to be like the bestest model, and you don't. You just want to like pass the exercise. Because
yeah,
obviously, like if child is like a linear deflection, right? That's like then like being a child is the same as fishing for 8 hours less. You get like all kinds of strange on like. But obviously, if a child fishes twice as much, then suddenly your model thinks he gets like 3 times as many fish because like being a child is like negative 8 hours, right? Like so it's totally messed up.
So let me walk you through my model. First, I built my outcome distribution, which is a zero inflated Poisson distribution with a certain probability of P and a certain probability of mu. We throw a legit link on P, which is just an intercept, and then the effect of being a camper and the effect of being a child. And we then chug a linear model for catching a certain number of fish onto mu, which is log transform, or which has a log link because it's a Poisson model behind this. Again, with an intercept for this, with a bait effect, with a person's effect, with a child effect, and with a log hours effect. I said
wait. Then you are actually assuming that hours are linearly because you assume the log mu is log hours.
Oh my God, shit, you're right. Damn. Well, thank you for giving me my explanation why I'm now running with linear hours earlier. Because if you fish twice as long, you can expect twice as many fish, right? Thank you, man.
And now that we're in log space, that's going to be kept in intercept, right?
Yeah. So I should actually take that BL out. So yeah, I run that model. I get my intercept for my Poisson stuff. I get my intercept for my we actually go fishing stuff. And what we find is that overall, park visitors are unlikely to fish. This is on a legit scale. And right now, I'm actually not quite sure. I actually think I may have misinterpreted this last night because this P right here should be the probability that they don't fish because this is the probability to produce some extra zeros. But I interpreted it as the probability that they do fish. So overall, park visitors are actually likely to fish because of this negative odds here on legit scale, which counter to my intuition, I'm saying here campers fish less because of B capital C0, which again, I probably have to flip around. So campers fish more and children are less likely to fish, which actually runs fully with my intuition. Again, funny enough, I was able to explain this away with me misinterpreting my model, where I said, I suggest this is because some children just are fucking weird and like to fish all the freaking time. And campers may not feel like lugging around fishing equipment on their trips if they go on foot, or do not want to worry about refrigeration if they stay the night and catch accidentally too many fish. So you can see how it's easy to explain away, right? It's scary how you can just explain away your misunderstanding. I will fix this as soon as we're done, by the way.
That's what I always thought, and the internet can prove nothing.
Yeah. So as we go to the Poisson part of this zero inflated Poisson model, once we are actually fishing, we're not very likely to catch much fish. So this is with our intercept of -209. This is on log scale, by the way. The parameters that explain this are all on log scale. So to get our alpha into the outcome scale, we would just like to exponentiate it. And so our rate, which we end up with on average for being an adult who fishes alone without live bait per hour, just gets us around 0.13 fish. Well, no, sorry, 0.12 fish. All right. Interestingly enough, when we look at the parameters, more people catch more fish, which is what we expected. So BP is positive. Using live, yes, and then going to BB, using live bait is effective. You catch more fish. And then in line with my intuition, children suck at fishing, which is another reason why you shouldn't force your children to fish. Thanks, mom and dad.
But children with live bait are better than adults without, right? Like the live bait is huge, 1.4, like times E is basically the effect, right? And then some power which you can't figure out, right?
But then you traumatize your children with having to spear tiny annelids. Stop it. Sorry,
do you want to spend 5 hours without a worm or 1 hour with a worm? Because that's what your model says.
I just don't want to hurt any animals. Man, I was 6. I'm working through some issues here.
But then you can just hang out for 4 more hours before you get your stupid fish.
Yeah, my Game Boy was out of battery. Right. So in line with my intuition, children catch less fish than adults. And yeah, that's it. This parameter that I slept onto log likelihood, I now realize should have just been an intercept. So scratch that. And if we turn to some actual model predictions, just to get to an understanding of what can we expect under certain conditions, if we just link our model onto itself, we get, for each of our observations, the probability of not having fished, and then the probability, the rate of catching something if one actually ended up fishing. And in this example, our probability of not going fishing was just around 0.39 when using inverse logit on a 0, which is up here at -0.45. So our average probability of not going fishing was 0.39. And then mu, I'm just here setting to 1 instead of the super small rate of 0.12, just to show what a potential histogram might end up looking like of our data. So now I'm just simulating some data with our model. And as you can see right here, this is our frequency distribution, which is quite obviously zero inflated, which was to be expected. And lastly, I just want to see,
it's not that obviously zero inflated, right? Because 1 is like the second last, and 2 is like, I agree it's zero inflated, but like at a quick glance, you could convince me. Just like the line experience, like if 3 other statisticians said this was not zero inflated, I could be convinced it's not.
Fair enough. Finally, let's see what the model predicts given our estimated parameters. So for this, I just simulate my data. Here's my simulation. And this now contains a simulation output for each of the sample in our data. We could then plot ourselves into oblivion with some counterfactual plots, but I just want to look at one single thing here. Just one counterfactual posterior prediction. As an example here, I assume that one adult spends 1 hour in the park without any use of live bait and not staying as a camper. So no camper, no live bait, this is an adult, and we spend 1 hour. You can see here how I'm going about just the new data. I link my model onto the new data to get my output.
I just want to say this is something that is underappreciated about like generatively models, that you can run them both ways. It is like insanely cool that you can just like do these counterfactuals to get like an intuition for like this machine of like interlocking parameters.
So in this setup now, on average, I expect to catch around 0.18 fish in this setup that I've just described, with an interval ranging from around 0.12 to around 0.25. And that is it for today, people. So I happily invite anyone to stay on for the discussion of log cumulative odds. That is, Jan, if you still have time for that, because I think you and I would probably be the ones spearheading that. I see you nodding, so cool. Anyone else, I would be more than happy to have you around for this and discuss it with us. I can also understand if you have to leave or you want to leave, which is also totally fine. And I'm already looking forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks.
Thanks, and happy Easter.
Oh, yeah, likewise. Okay, here we go. Resume the recording. After about half an hour, sorry, no, actually much longer. I think we've now sat on this for 45 minutes. I think we've got it. So let me start this again. Here on the right-hand side, we can see the formula, which is where we're going to start from. So now assume that you are currently slotting into rating 3 or ranking 3 or category 3. Your cumulative log odds, and if you do the exponentiating of that, your cumulative probability of falling into category 3 or any preceding category, so 1 or 2, is whatever the log odds tell you they are. Now, if your predictor, that is this X here, increases and you have a positive association of your predictor with your ranking, so a positive beta value, then you will move from being assigned to category 3 to, for example, category 4 or category 5. Hence, the cumulative log odds and the cumulative proportion of everything that is below your new assignment, so by definition, above your previous one, which is everything above your previous assignment of k equals 3, has to be a bigger proportion than it was previously. And the only way you can get a bigger proportion above your previous assignment of k equals 3 is by diminishing the k equals 3 and smaller part. And that's why you have to do the subtraction here. Because in order to show the positive association between your predictor and your outcome ranking, to show this positive association, the previous ranking that you were assigned to has to diminish in probability as your predictor increases. And that's the solution, I think.
Yeah, I found a graphical way to explain this because I like to think in graphs. So
can you show us that? Can you share your screen for that?
I can
Screen's
show
all
it.
yours.
I can show it on this. So
yes, I'll put you on speaker view.
Perfect.
Okay.
Let me just
Spotlighted you. Everyone sees you in full screen.
Perfect. So here is a graph. We have our response variable down here and our log cumulative probability over here. Is it inverted on yours or is it?
No, it's fine.
It's fine. So
yeah,
it
does the mirroring for us.
It goes up. The higher the value, the higher it goes up. And here I'm showing variable A in the closed dot. So let's say we know that variable B is higher. Okay, so B has to be higher, which means the value of the response variable has to be higher. If we start plotting this, would we expect to see more or less of A relative to B in the lowest value? We would expect to see less because A is less than B. So we could put in our little dot there, and then we could move up. And we could move up and we could probably find that there would be fewer B here as well. And then we might go a bit higher and then find that we have more here, and then something like that there. But the whole issue that we were freaking out with is that we've got B that is greater than A, but we have to start with subtraction. And that's the subtraction right there.
Yeah, because that center point where they flip over is where the log odds are exactly 0.
Exactly.
We done it.
That was tough.
Yeah.
That was
Fuck yes.
I'm a bit mentally taxed. I'm a bit.
Same here. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here and then we can just talk.